The Identity Trap, A Story of Ideas and Power in Our Time by Yasha Mounk is an intellectual excavation of how identity-based ideologies have grown to shape contemporary politics, institutions, and social behavior, often in ways their original proponents never intended. At its core, the book is both a history lesson and a warning, told through a gripping narrative of philosophy, cultural shifts, and political upheaval. Mounk begins by tracing the ideological roots of what is now widely referred to as identity politics, not in the culture wars of the 2010s, but in the postmodern and postcolonial academic thinking of the mid-20th century. He introduces readers to a cast of thinkers, Michel Foucault, Edward Said, Derek Bell, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who were primarily concerned with power, narrative, and historical injustice. Their work was nuanced and often confined to academic discourse. However, over time, their ideas were stripped of context and transformed into doctrines that fused into the prevailing ideological structure dominating many universities, media spaces, and social movements today. Mounk doesn't vilify these figures. Instead, he honors the intellectual complexity they brought while showing how these concepts were simplified and weaponized outside academia. As Mounk travels through the decades, he tells the story of how ideas like standpoint epistemology, the notion that knowledge is deeply influenced by social position, and intersectionality moved from niche theoretical debates into the cultural mainstream. These concepts were designed to illuminate the unseen layers of discrimination, but Mounk argues that their modern interpretation has become doctrinaire, making identity the lens through which all knowledge and morality are judged. This, he says, is the trap. The well-intentioned pursuit of justice through identity has become a rigid ideology, prone to silencing dissent and deepening division. The narrative then shifts to real-world case studies where these ideas collided with public policy and organizational culture. Mounk recounts stories from universities where speech codes and diversity training sessions began to enforce a specific moral orthodoxy. He discusses corporate and media environments where failing to use the right terminology or to affirm a particular worldview can result in professional exile. These stories are not offered as sensational anecdotes but as evidence of a systemic shift in how institutions define virtue and handle conflict. He turns next to the political consequences. Mounk is particularly concerned with how the left's embrace of identity-based ideology has alienated moderate and working-class voters. By shifting focus from universal values like equality and dignity to narrower conceptions based on group identity, progressive politics risks becoming exclusionary. This, he argues, has created fertile ground for populist backlash and authoritarian resurgence. The story is not just about the left, it's also about how the right exploits the excesses of identity politics to fuel reactionary agendas. Through interviews and reflections, Mounk introduces us to activists and scholars, many of whom are progressive themselves, who have grown disillusioned with the ideological rigidity dominating their fields. These individuals speak of a chilling effect on speech, a fear of challenging orthodoxy even when evidence demands it. Mounk weaves these voices into his larger argument, presenting them as canaries in the coal mine warning of an intellectual monoculture. Rather than merely critique, the book digs into the psychological and moral appeal of identity-based thinking. Mounk understands that people yearn to be seen, to have their experiences validated. Identity politics, at its best, offers a language for those who've been historically silenced. But when recognition becomes a zero-sum game, where acknowledging one group's pain requires diminishing another's voice, it turns corrosive. He tells this story with empathy, capturing the internal conflicts many feel when navigating today's moral landscape. Mounk dives into educational environments next, where he recounts how curricula and teacher training increasingly frame history and literature through an identity-first perspective. This is not about whether slavery or colonialism should be taught, they must, but about how they are taught. If education becomes a process of assigning moral guilt based on demographic traits rather than fostering critical thinking, it does a disservice to students of all backgrounds. These changes, he argues, are not creating stronger citizens but more anxious and distrustful ones. He then pivots to the social consequences of living in a world where identity determines moral worth. In one compelling section, Mounk shares stories of interpersonal fallout, friendships lost, families divided, students alienated, due to disagreements not about values, but about language and framework. He paints a portrait of a society that is simultaneously hyper-conscious of offense and increasingly incapable of forgiveness or ambiguity. The heart of Mounk's argument is that we must find a path between denial of injustice and ideological zealotry. He proposes a recommitment to philosophical liberalism, an idea not of centrism or neutrality, but of a universal respect for the individual and a belief in debate, persuasion, and incremental progress. He contends that recognizing identity should not come at the cost of shared humanity, and that justice is best pursued when grounded in reason and openness. Toward the end of the book, Mounk addresses critics who claim he is simply advocating a return to the status quo. He rebuffs this by insisting that liberalism must evolve, it must confront racism, sexism, and historical wrongs, but it must do so without abandoning the principles that allow pluralistic societies to survive. He acknowledges liberalism's failures and blind spots, but argues that its adaptive, self-critical nature is what gives it enduring power. He offers practical solutions, such as reforming institutional diversity efforts to focus on socio-economic inclusion, re-emphasizing civic education, and fostering environments that prize complexity over slogans. These are not utopian dreams but pragmatic steps that aim to restore the balance between justice and freedom. Mounk calls on leaders across fields to resist ideological capture and build institutions that reflect the diversity of thought as well as of background. Mounk's storytelling is personal, too. He shares his own experiences as an immigrant and a Jewish man in Germany, later the U.S., grappling with questions of belonging, privilege, and moral responsibility. These moments offer a human anchor to the abstract debates, showing how even well-meaning frameworks can leave individuals feeling flattened or misrepresented. In his closing chapter, Mounk warns of a future where identity-based ideologies entrench themselves not just in discourse but in law, policy, and technology. He paints a chilling vision of a society where algorithmic decision-making and surveillance are infused with identity logic, producing more rigid hierarchies than the ones they intended to dismantle. But he also sees hope in the younger generation, who are beginning to question dogma and seek out thinkers willing to embrace nuance. Ultimately, the identity trap is a call to courage, not the courage to shout louder than your opponent, but to listen, to question, and to defend the principles that make pluralistic democracy possible. Through history, philosophy, narrative, and critique, Mounk urges readers to escape the trap, not by denying identity, but by refusing to be defined by it alone. In doing so, he offers a compelling vision for a more thoughtful, more inclusive, and more resilient future.